All the Young Dudes, James's Perspective by Stay in Dreams. Chapter 15. First Year Aftermath. Most of the Gryffindors were gathered in the common room, a buzz of speculation filling the air as they debated who could have pulled off the latest stunt. The Marauders, usually eager to bask in the limelight of any such debate, slunk upstairs, their faces pale with an unmistakable trace of guilt. The dormitory was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual chaos. Remus sat on his bed, staring despondently at the floor, his usual poise replaced by an unmistakable look of sickness and regret. James, watching him with a mix of apprehension and concern, knew that the spell Remus had performed was nothing short of spectacular, but it had been driven by emotion, and that was where the trouble lay. "What happened?" James ventured carefully, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "Did you lose control?" That was some seriously strong magic. He wanted Remus to reassure him, to confirm that it was all an accident. But deep down, James understood that what Remus had done required just not power, but a level of precision and intent. "It was incredible," Sirius interjected, suddenly his eyes gleaming with unrestrained satisfaction. "Snivellers will think twice before messing with us again." But James frowned, troubled. "We didn't actually mean to hurt him, did we?" "He's fine," Sirius dismissed with a wave of his hand. "He was just putting on a show to get us in trouble." "Will we get in trouble?" Peter asked, his voice trembling slightly as he fidgeted nervously. "We didn't all do it, did we? It was only—" Sirius gave him a sharp thump on the back of the head. "You dolls," he said, shaking his head in disgust. "We're marauders, all for one and one for all." "Whatever that means," Peter muttered, rubbing his head and sulking off to his bed. "I did it," Remus said morosely, still fixated on the floor. "You lot shouldn't get in trouble." "It was half my idea," Sirius protested, his voice rising. "I did the research. Don't worry, Lupin. I bet he's fine." But Remus remained slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground. "If he is, it's no thanks to me." He finally met James's eyes, his amber ones filled with an intensity that made James's heart sink. "I did mean to hurt him." James held his gaze, nodding slightly. Despite what Remus had said, the depth of regret in his eyes spoke volumes. That was what mattered to James. The knock on the door was a welcome distraction, breaking the heavy silence. It was Frank Longbottom, looking grave. "You four are to come to McGonagall's office now," he instructed. James' stomach lurched. What if Snape had been seriously hurt? "We didn't mean to cause any real harm." They followed Frank down the stairs and through the common room, where every eye turned to watch them. The silence that followed their departure was deafening, more unsettling than any noise. James kept his eyes firmly on the ground, but he couldn't help glancing up through the rim of his glasses. Lily's eyes were still red from crying, and the sight made James feel as though he'd been slapped. Dumbledore stood beside McGonagall's desk in her office, his calm, serene presence at odds with the tension in the room. He smiled as they lined up before him. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "Good evening, Headmaster," they used. "You may be pleased to know that Mr. Snape is quite well," Dumbledore continued, his tone almost conversational, "though I suspect his pride has been rather bruised." A wave of relief washed over James. Snape hadn't been hurt, at least not seriously. He tried to catch Remus's eye, but Remus was still staring at the floor, seemingly unable to lift his gaze. "Mr. Snape seems to believe that you four had a hand in his unfortunate predicament," Dumbledore went on, his gaze settling on James. "Particularly you, Mr. Potter." James opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again. He would take the blame if it meant protecting his friends. It was a small price to pay, but before he could utter a word, Remus stepped forward. "It was me, sir," Remus said quietly, his voice unwavering. He said some things earlier, and I was angry. I wanted to teach him a lesson. Dumbledore's pale blue eyes met Remus's. The old man nodded, evidently satisfied with the explanation. James felt a swell of pride for his friend. Remus, usually so reserved and cautious, was stepping up to take responsibility. It was clear he cared deeply, even if he didn't always show it. "I see. You acted alone?" Dumbledore asked, his voice gentle. "Yes," Remus said, pulling out his wand. "Look, I can prove it." "No need," Dumbledore interrupted quickly. "I believe you, Mr. Lupin." James wanted to say something to protect Remus, but Sirius beat him to it. "It wasn't just him, sir," Sirius blurted out, his frustration bubbling over. "I researched the spell, learned how to do it. It's just as much my fault." "You mean to say you planned this, Mr. Black?" McGonagall's voice was sharp as a blade. "Planned an attack on another pupil? 10 points from Gryffindor, each." Sirius hung his head, clearly deflated. "And detention for all of you, for a month," McGonagall continued, her tone stern. "I find it very difficult to believe that Mr. Lupin acted entirely alone." The four of them lowered their heads, accepting their fates. "You may go," Dumbledore said quietly. "I trust you will all take the time to apologize to Mr. Snape." As they turned to leave, Sirius made an indignant noise, and James elbowed him sharply. "Mr. Lupin, just a moment." The rest of them left the office, with McGonagall shooting them away, a warning about lengthening their detentions ringing in their ears. Back in the common room, which had mostly emptied out, the remaining Gryffindors gave them curious looks. Sirius didn't wait until the door was shut behind them before he exploded. "That slimy little snitch!" he roared, pacing back and forth in the front of his bed. "I could strangle him!" Peter slumped into his bed, muttering darkly. "Lupin might beat you to it." Sirius froze, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Peter, wide-eyed and shrinking under Sirius's glare, stammered, Nothing, just, well, he did say he was trying to hurt him, didn't he?" "You hear Dumbledore," Sirius snapped. "Snape's fine. He was just pretending to get us in trouble." James, feeling the need to mediate, spoke up carefully. "We know, mate, but you have to admit Remus did go a bit overboard." Sirius gaped at his friends, disbelief etched on his face. "Just whose side are you on, anyway?" "Come on, this isn't about sides," James said, trying to keep the peace. "It's just, now, you're starting to sound like Evans." Snivellus got exactly what was coming to him. "I know," James ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "I'm not trying to argue that. Just, well, you'd think we should be worried about Remus?" "Worried?" Sirius crossed his arms, looking exasperated. "He'd never actually hurt anyone." I know that, Remus, despite his gruff exterior and his explosive temper, is a good person. It's why I'm friends with him. But sometimes his magic flares up when his emotions run wild." "I didn't mean it like that," James said, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I just meant, do you think he's okay?" Sirius blinked, taken aback. "Okay?" "You spent Christmas together," Peter chimed in. "He seemed all right then, didn't he?" Sirius paused, and James watched him closely, noting the thoughtfulness in his eyes. After a moment, Sirius sighed. "Remus is fine," he said firmly. "I told you, it wasn't even his idea. I dragged him into it." He sank onto his bed, finally looking more at ease. "Right then," James clapped his hands together, attempting to display the lingering tension. "Aside from all that, it was a bloody brilliant prank, wasn't it?" By the time Remus returned, the tension in the room had dissipated like smoke in a breeze. Peter and Sirius were engrossed in a heated game of chess, while James, in the bathroom, brushing his teeth, tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. The door slammed shut with a definitive thud, followed by Sirius's loud exclamation. "You're back! What did Dumbledore want?" James poked his head out of the bathroom, toothbrush jutting from his mouth like a comical prop. Remus looked distinctly uncomfortable, his movements stiff and awkward. Nothing much, Remus muttered, shuffling to his bed and kicking off his shoes with a grimace. Just got a lecture about not doing it again. Really? Sirius pressed, following him over to the bed. Did he ask how we did it? Did you show him? No, He just told me to not repeat it, Remus said, sounding as if he were forcing the words out. He stood abruptly, turning his back to them as he rummaged for his pyjamas. James shot Sirius a warning glance, picking up on the edge in Remus's voice. Sure, Sirius replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Remus brushed past James on his way to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him with a touch more force than necessary. When he emerged, he headed straight for bed, drawing the curtains with a snap. The other boys went to bed soon after, but James found sleep elusive. His mind was plagued with troubling thoughts. The image of Snape, pale and sprawled on the floor, Remus gripping his wand with white-knuckled intensity, Lily's tear-filled eyes. It wasn't long before he heard footsteps approaching. They'd both learned the silencing charm the week before Christmas after they'd accidentally woken Peter. Sirius, always resourceful, cast the charm as he climbed into James's bed, and James sat up immediately, a mix of curiosity and concern in his eyes. Hi. Hey, what's up? Sirius hesitated before asking. Do you think Remus is mad at me? James blinked, taken aback. What? I mean, he seemed a bit off, didn't he? Sirius chewed on his lip nervously. Do you reckon he's annoyed with me? Since I sort of, convinced him to go along with the spell. I'm wondering if he blames me for getting him in trouble. James thought about Remus's dismissive attitude, the way he'd slammed the door, and his eyes filled with regret. Nah, he said after a moment, shaking his head. I think he's just feeling guilty. What, about Snivelus? Sirius's tone was skeptical. Yeah, he seemed pretty torn up about it earlier. I reckon he's blaming himself. Sirius started. Well, that's daft. Snape didn't even get hurt. James yawned and shrugged. If you're really worried, why not talk to him tomorrow? Sirius nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, you're right. Maybe I'll have a word with him. McGonagall had been unyielding about their detentions, even going so far to separate them. Sirius was tasked with scrabbling cauldrons in the dungeons, Peter with polishing trophies in the awards room, and James with reconfiguring every astronomy telescope in the tower. Remus drew the worst straw of all, marking out the orderly. To make it even less pleasant, they weren't allowed to use their wands, and each night they had to start all over again. Cruel and unusual punishment. That's what it is, Peter grumbled, at the end of the first week, collapsing into bed, filthy and exhausted. Don't whinge, Sirius grumbled back. I'd love to be polishing trophies. Who knows what I've caught scrapping out crusty potions from those wretched cauldrons. James simply groaned, removing his glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. As the days wore on, Remus grew increasingly withdrawn. He started avoiding the marauders, retreating into his own shell much like he had before. They became friends. The difference now was that he usually had a book clutched in his hands. He seemed to spend all his spare time either reading or buried in homework. Every night after they had finished their detentions and homework, Remus would draw the curtains around his bed, the soft glow of his wand casting eerie shadows as he hunched over a book. His newfound dedication to his studies paid off. He started pulling ahead in classes, quickly becoming one of the top students. James was genuinely pleased for him. Remus's growing confidence in his abilities was a sight to behold. But he couldn't shake the feeling of missing his friend. Remus didn't even ask for help with his essays anymore. Remus's mysterious visits to Madame Pomfrey's office became a regular occurrence, but she always returned before curfew, which was unusual. The other marauders couldn't help but ask where he'd been every evening as they prepped for bed. Homework, Remus would shrug, or sometimes detention, though he hadn't had another detention since the prank. They persistently tried to include Remus in their teams, but he turned down every invitation. Nevertheless, they continued with their plans. When they weren't in classes or detention, they spent their time plotting pranks or exploring the castle under James's invisibility cloak. Sirius had taken it upon himself to catalogue every hidden passage they found, and James eagerly joined him. Rumor had it there was a monster lurking somewhere in the castle, which sounded fantastically intriguing. Peter, too, was always keen for their nocturnal adventures, whispering excitedly about dung bombs and color-changing toffees as they huddled under the cloak to sneak out at night. James had thought that nothing could ever tear them apart once they became the Marauders. It infuriated him that Severus Snape, of all people, seemed to have managed it in a single evening. Despite their best efforts to include Remus, he remained aloof, as if he had re-erected the walls that had once separated him from them. James tried to act as if nothing had changed, but he could only imagine how desperate his eyes must have looked every time he glanced at Remus. Although Remus was always polite and joined them for meals, his presence was distant, like a ghost flickering just out of reach. As January drew to a close, James found himself in yet another detention. This time, however, it didn't seem quite as dreadful. Professor Flitwick had assigned him the rather less daunting task of organizing and polishing the Quidditch brooms. So, on the chilly evening, the Quidditch supply shed, tucked away at the edge of the pitch, became James's temporary refuge. Armed with a pile of polishing cloths, he set to work with a surprising sense of calm. As he meticulously polished each broom, aligning them in neat rows, the rhythmic swish of the cloth and the orderly arrangement of the brooms provided a soothing distraction from his usual wild wind of thoughts. While wrestling with a particularly stubborn clean sweep, the door to the shed creaked open. James glanced up, expecting yet another student sentenced to detention. But his eyebrows shot up in surprise when Marlene McKinnon walked in, broom in hand. There was a brief, awkward pause before Marlene offered a tentative smile. "Hey, Potter, fancy seeing you here," she said, her tone friendly. "Molly!" James exclaimed with a playful smirk, using the nickname he'd heard her father call her. "Are you here to join the polishing party?" Marlene, slightly taken aback, blushed, but managed a small smile. "Just finished practicing." "You like flying?" James asked, intrigued. He'd seen her schools during their flying lessons, and had to admit she was probably the best in the class. After himself, of course. Even outshining Sirius in some aspects. But he hadn't realized her interest went beyond the lessons. Marlene nodded. "Kind of runs in the family. I want to try out for the team next year." "Me too," James grinned widely. "I'm hoping to be a chaser." "Peter," Marlene replied with a hint of determination. There was a brief silence, and James found himself fidgeting with the bristles of the broom. He wasn't usually at a loss of words, but he wasn't quite used to having a one-on-one conversation with a girl like this. Fortunately, Marlene broke the silence. "Do you want help?" she asked, closing the door behind her with a soft click. James blinked in surprise. Sure, but technically this is my detention, Flitwick's idea." Marlene shrugged. "I've got nothing better to do. Plus, I quite enjoy taking care of brooms. It's oddly relaxing." James chuckled, flashing her a charismatic grin. "Well, lucky me. You can tackle the comet shoes over there. They've got a mind of their own, those." Marlene eyed the brooms with a skeptical look. "Mind of their own? Or are you just afraid to admit you can't control them?" James laughed, finding her response refreshingly candid. "A bit of both, I suppose. But don't worry, McKinnon. I'm a certified broom whisperer." As Marlene joined him in the polishing endeavor, a light-hearted banter unfolded. James, ever the showman, spun exaggerated tales of his Quidditch prowess, claiming that even the brooms bowed to him in gratitude. Marlene, though initially reserved, began to warm up, revealing a sharp wit and an easy humor. "Watch out, Potter," Marlene teased, with a twinkle in her eye. I've heard even the numbers 1000s are plotting against you. James clutched his chest in mock offense. Oh, you wound me, Molly. The numbers 1000 adore me. We share a special bond, you know. Marlene rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide her amused grin. Special bond? More like they're trying to escape your overconfident clutches. Their banter flowed effortlessly, full with laughter and camaraderie. James, who often felt the need to be the center of attention, found it refreshing to be with Marlene. She didn't seem to care for his usual exuberance, and had a quiet way of seeing life that was oddly grounding. As they took a break, sitting amidst the brooms, catching their breaths, Marlene broached a topic James had been avoiding since it happened, the rain cloud incident. James, do you think soaking Snape was the best idea? Marlene asked cautiously. James sighed, gold clouding his expression. Despite his efforts to avoid the topic, he felt a surprising lack of judgment from Marlene. It was as if all the words he'd been trying to suppress since the incident simply spilled out. Honestly, no. It got out of hand. We never meant for it to go that far. Marlene nodded thoughtfully. Lily talks about it a lot. She thinks you're a bit self-absorbed, cocky, and that you don't care who you hurt as long as you get a laugh. James winced, running a hand through his hair. I get why she'd think that, but it's not really who I am, you know. Sometimes I get carried away. He was confident. He was an attention seeker, but he'd never want to hurt anyone. The idea that Lily saw him in such a negative light felt like a sharp jaw. Marlene looked at him with a knowing gaze. I don't think you're that person, James. Not entirely. I've seen you with your friends, with other students, with professors. There's another side of you, kind and genuine. You've got an ego for sure, but also a heart to match it. Feeling suddenly vulnerable, James attempted to deflect with a half-hearted grin. Well, you know, I've got an image to maintain. Marlene, however, wasn't buying it. Maybe you should show a different side sometimes. People might appreciate it even more. She nudged his arm playfully. I know I'm starting to. The sincerity in Marlene's words struck a chord with James. For the first time, someone wasn't just accepting his louder, brusher side, but encouraging him to embrace the softer, kinder aspects of himself. It felt unfamiliar, and though he wasn't sure others would accept it as easily, he was glad that Marlene did. He found himself developing a newfound appreciation for her. Usually he aimed for the stars, but perhaps he needed someone to ground him now and then to let him rest on the grass for a bit.